Hello everybody, my name is Abby and I'm Pinkzilla Designs. And today I'm going to be showing you how I made this punk-inspired cadet hat. If you want to follow along with me, I have a sewing pattern linked below to my Etsy. It's just a few dollars, but you can also easily recreate the sewing patterns. You just need the measurements of your head and then use that to make circumference in a circle. You know, like you remember pi and stuff from elementary school? You can figure it out. Okay, so for this project, you're gonna need your main fabric, interfacing, lining fabric, decorative fabric, a 1/4 inch bias tape, a 1 inch bias tape, a brim insert, some scissors, a sewing machine, and some fabric chalk or a marker, and also an iron. Now, I consider myself pretty thrifty, so for this project I actually thrifted all of the materials. The main fabric I made out of denim. I make a lot of upcycle projects with jeans, so I had a lot of leftover denim laying around. For the decorative fabric, I have this flannel that I also used on this shirt that I upcycled, and I used that for the decorative portions. For the lining, I just used some cotton I had lying around. And then for like the hat parts itself, here's a little trick. I went to Goodwill and they were selling like brand new hats never worn before, so no, they are not stinky, for $1.25, and from that I was able to harvest the brim insert, the circumference tape, the bias tape for the back, and in a previous project I even like took the Velcro closure. So here's a video of how I just seam ripped that open, and it was kind of like skinning an animal. So for this project, you're going to need a brim insert. You can get them online on like Amazon in packs, or you can do what I did, sacrifice it from a hat, or I have seen people make them out of either thin sheets of plastic or thin pieces of cardboard. Just do whatever works for you. To start the project, you're going to want to line up your pattern pieces. You can use this little star marking to make sure the pieces are all lined up properly. My pattern pieces also have a little 1 inch square, so you can double check and make sure that they're printed at the right dimensions. And then you're going to want to cut out all the pieces. So for the main fabric, you're going to want to cut out the brim, the circumference side band, and the top of the hat. For my project, I wanted to have an exposed seam here on the front and on the back, so I just cut out 2 pieces of the band. If you don't want a seam on the front, then you would just fold the fabric and cut the pattern on the fold. And you're also going to want to cut out your closure. You can do a Velcro closure, a tie closure, you can make a closure with a button. Be creative, whatever you want. You're also going to want to cut out your lining pieces. Now the lining pieces only apply to the main structure of the hat, so just going to cut out the 2 hat band pieces and the hat top piece. This is optional, but I use interfacing for the hat. As you can see, it still holds its shape when it's off of my head, whereas this hat did not use interfacing and it's just kind of floppy, so it's just whatever you prefer. And for the decorative fabric, I cut out this little skull piece and some patches. We'll walk through it. The first step, take all of your pieces to the serging machine and serge all of the raw edges. Now this is optional because we are lining the piece, but I just wanted to show off my beautiful brand new Baby Lock Vibrant serger machine. Oh, isn't she sexy? For me, since I cut the band out of 2 pieces instead of 1 continuous piece, I put the front sides together, right sides facing, and sewed down on my seam allowance. I then opened up that seam allowance and sewed each of the pieces down. I wanted to do a black and pink moment. In case you can't tell, that's kind of like my whole thing. So I used pink thread on the black denim for a contrasting look. Now that the band is 1 continuous flat piece, we can add the decorations and spice it up a little. I got this spray adhesive. It's called basting spray. It's mainly used in quilting. It washes off with a little bit of water. And I sprayed the back of my little skull piece that I cut out, and I stuck it onto the hat where I wanted it. And I also wanted to add a little functional pocket. I don't know, you could like stick a lighter or a couple bucks in there. So I just measured a line about 4 inches and I cut a straight slit And then on the edges of the slit, I cut a little triangle. I'll put like a little diagram up right here. I also got some more pieces of flannel and I stuck them onto the hat top and the hat sides, and we're going to distress that later. Okay, so we're gonna take this over to the sewing machine and install the zipper. I have a box full of zippers, so I just picked out this cute hot pink zipper. I put it underneath the slit, and then I just folded the inside of the slit over a couple of centimeters and pinned it into place. When I got to the triangles, just fold those completely inward so that the triangle is inside and it creates like a full box. Then you're gonna tack that down with just a regular old straight stitch. I used a zipper foot, but I did not use the zipper foot properly. I just couldn't get my main foot in there because it kept getting stuck on the zipper teeth. So now we have a zipper, but the zipper isn't doing anything. So I went over to my lining fabric, I traced the outline of the hat band, and I cut out a backing for the pocket that was the same size as the zipper area. And I used some black thread so that it would blend into my denim and look invisible. I also sewed it down in the ditch between the front seam so that it would be completely invisible and you can't see the thread for the pocket from the front. And now we have a functional pocket. You can hide a little something in there. For the skull patch, just sew it down with a straight stitch using the mark on your foot as a guide all the way around. You can sew it down first and then cut away if that's easier for you. So for the decorative portion, I wanted to try out this technique I've been seeing on my TikTok For You page. I think it's called stipple stitch or a burrow stitch. I'll show like some of my main inspirations here. And this was my first time, I was just winging it, so I don't know if this is the correct way to do it. I'm not gonna lie, people are gatekeeping this technique, so I'm here to open the gates. So the first thing I did is I sewed down parallel lines on the flannel patches, about 1/4 inch apart, using the foot on my sewing machine as a guide. Then I got my Dremel. Now a Dremel is a very useful tool if you like distressing clothing like denim, jeans, hats, anything. And I just got my Dremel and I just went over that whole area. I wanted the flannel to look like it was melting and disintegrating into the denim, but I got a little bit too nervous. I feel like I could have distressed it way more, but I still like how it came out. Once it was distressed to a point that I liked, I took it back to the sewing machine and I sewed perpendicular lines, same distance apart. Now, the Dremel did kind of tear through a lot of my top stitching from my first pass, so I had to go back over that spot. So maybe the first round of stitching isn't necessary. I was just concerned that the basting spray wouldn't be able to hold it down when the Dremel was going. My cat is... I decided to add the interfacing after the distressing, but I kind of forgot about the interfacing and I ended up sewing the band together in the back. Whoops. Anyways, I cut out the pieces out of some mid-weight fusible interfacing, took them over to my ironing board, and ironed the interfacing down. So now it's time to sew the circumference band to the top of the hat. Just line them up based on the markings. I had to redraw my markings on top of the interfacing. I used clips to clip around the entire circumference of the hat top, just because I find them easier to use than pins. And I sewed down on the seam allowance, making sure to sew next to the serging marks so none of the serging marks are going to show through when we fold that inside out. Then I flipped the hat inside out and did a top stitch about 1/4 inch away from that seam line. Now the top portion of our hat is done. We're going to do the same thing with the lining. Now that the lining is done, we're going to insert the lining into the hat, wrong sides facing. So it'll be hat, wrong side of lining, right side of lining. Yeah. Then line up those raw edges and baste those two pieces together. At this point, I decided to go ahead and add the bias tape to kind of like the ponytail opening in the back. Now, I ended up salvaging my 1/4 inch bias tape from that hat that I sacrificed earlier. To sew bias tape onto the opening, you line the pieces up, right sides together, and then you fold the bias tape inward, and then fold it again and sew it down. At this point, you're also going to want to add your closure. I decided to go for a tie closure. The way that I made the tie closure is I just doubled the length of the closure pattern piece included in the PDF and sewed it on either side so it's like a little tie. Okay, now the main part of our hat is done. Let's go ahead and turn our attention to the brim. For my hat, I wanted to make it look like the denim was ripped off and kind of revealing the flannel underneath. So I only cut the top part of the hat out of denim, and then I cut the bottom part out of my lining fabric. Then I chopped off a chunk from the front of the brim and traced that chunk onto my flannel fabric and cut that out with some seam allowance. I then lined up the flannel underneath the denim so that the denim would have an exposed hem that I could distress. And I did the same thing for the lining, except I sewed them right sides facing so that the seam would not be exposed. I then sewed the two pieces together into like a pouch and clipped the curve, making sure I wasn't cutting into the thread itself. Flip the piece inside out, give it a quick press on the iron, and insert your brim into the pouch. You're going to want to stretch the fabric over the brim so it's kind of taut and sits in the way that you want, and then clip down the edge. Tack down that opening with a basting stitch. Now this is the hard part. You're going to want to line up the center of the brim with the center marking from the circumference of the hat and clip that down and then slowly clip each side. It's going to take a lot of wrestling because the brim is pretty stiff and we want it to kind of lay flat against the seam, so work slowly and top stitch it down. Be careful you don't sew into the plastic brim itself. Now our hat is basically done. I'm just going to add some finishing touches. So I salvaged this kind of sweatband from that hat I sacrificed at the beginning, or you could use a 1-inch bias tape. Starting from the edges of the hat, I fold the hat inward about 1/4 of an inch and then clip down the sweatband right on top of it. Once it's clipped all the way around, including the edge on the brim, I'm going to sew it down with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Be extra careful when you're sewing over the brim part. For me, my thread was visible, so I had to make sure I was lining it up really nicely because any kind of crookedness would show. Now this next part is optional and depends on the quality of your sewing machine, but most hats have visible stitching on the brim, so I wanted to do that too, but just on the denim portion. I lined up the edge of my foot with the edge of the brim and stitched down some lines. This was pretty difficult. My sewing machine does not like sewing through the brim insert, but I regularly abuse my sewing machine, so it happens. I've also seen people use a free motion foot to scribble on the brim, or you could do some sewing machine type embroidery. There's a lot you can do, so just get creative with it. After that, we are finished, and this is a look at the final product. This project is kind of tough. I would rate it at an intermediate level, but I got it done in about 4 hours, and I'm sure you guys can too. There are a lot more ways that you can spice up this hat. You could add grommets, you could add spikes, you could distress it further with the Dremel. In fact, I'm gonna go ahead and put up a couple of ideas that I have here to give you some inspiration for when you create your hat. This was my first ever YouTube video, so I'm sorry if it's a little scuffed, but I'm really excited about this channel. I'm an aspiring fashion designer and I specialize in thrift flipping and upcycling, so I'm going to be posting thrift flip upcycle tutorials here as much as I can. I already have a ton on my TikTok, and this is my first ever full-length video. I also hope to be designing more digital patterns, so if you like what you see, give me a like and a follow. Also, if you like this hat or this outfit, it's currently for sale on my shop, so you can check out those links. Thank you for watching. Bye-bye!